welcome to another episode of the RJ Webinar series that we host at the RJ for International Institute. I have a special guest today. It's Marina, who is the founder of the Forgiveness Project. We're going to talk about forgiveness and restorative justice with Marina today, but I'll let Marina introduce herself first and say how she was originally connected to the concept of forgiveness, not necessarily of restorative justice, but of forgiveness.
Yeah, hi Theo, lovely to be with you. My name is Marina Cantacuzino, and I tend to describe myself as a journalist, a broadcaster, founder of the Forgiveness Project, author, and peace activist. How I came to this subject was by accident, in that I was a jobbing journalist. I had 3 youngish children and I was the main breadwinner. And the Iraq War happened. And as a journalist, well, as a person, as a human being, I felt absolutely incensed by the notion that you can bomb a country into a democracy. I was convinced the harder you come down on people, the more they regroup and re-emerge in a more angry and resistant way. So I went on the peace marches. As you know, nothing happened. And I thought, well, as a journalist, what can I do? And what I could do was, in my spare time, start collecting stories which I thought were countercultural at the time. So stories that focused on compassion, forgiveness, personal narratives from victims, but also from perpetrators, because I felt I wanted to understand why violence happens. And that's where restorative justice came in. I'd never heard of the term before. So this was 2003. And suddenly people were suggesting, why don't you talk to this person who still has connection with the man who burgled their house, or Joe Berry, whose father was killed in the Brighton bomb. She still talks to the man who planted the bomb. And I became very aware of the term restorative justice during that time. And so many of the stories were restorative justice narratives, and they became an exhibition. And I thought my life would go back to journalism. But this exhibition, which I called the F word, because the main focus was forgiveness, this exhibition was just so successful. It was just phenomenal, and it took me by surprise. And it got a lot of media attention. And I remember in the visitors book, the then director of what was called the Restorative Justice Consortium, she wrote a note, and she said, I wish I'd thought of this idea. This is the way to bring concepts of restorative justice to people so they understand it.
Mm-hmm.
And so my life just went in a completely different direction. I thought it was just going to be another project. I thought it would just essentially be an article in a magazine. I had no idea it would become an exhibition and then a charity, which I founded, called the Forgiveness Project, which has storytelling at its heart.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, fascinating. I don't know if you agree with this, but kind of my life philosophy is not to try and plan what is going to happen in our life, but to understand what is happening in our life, which is why sometimes struggling to make things happen, or when things do happen and we get disappointed. I have more of a kind of what it happened, and let's now try and understand why it happened. And your part is quite interesting to understand why this brought you to this work. So, you already made the connection with restorative justice, and I'm just going to go straight to the hard talk. And as you know, I kind of sit in the middle when it comes to restorative justice, being a researcher. So I see the good and the bad, the risks and the positives. What do you think could be the risk, or many risks, or one risk of having restorative justice associated with forgiveness?
The main, I think, problem with associating that concept and that word is that people would feel obliged to forgive, that people would think that restorative justice has anything to do with forgiveness. I think in many ways it doesn't. And if you make it an obligation, it quickly becomes a tyranny, forgiveness. So I don't think the conversations really overlap. However, I remember being at a conference in Belfast early on. This was like 2005 or something, or 6, and I can't remember who it was, but whoever it was, you'd know him. He was a leading proponent of restorative justice. He asked the audience, what is the key word when we're thinking about restorative justice? What is it? And people said dialogue, understanding, compassion. And then he said, no, it's forgiveness. So I thought that was interesting and contentious. I kind of knew what he meant, because I think there is something already about having a forgiving nature that brings you into a room with someone who's hurt you. You've already made a step in that direction. Yes, you want answers. Yes, you want to have your voice heard. Yes, you want things to change. But you have to be prepared to see the other person as a fellow human being. And there's something of forgiveness in that. And I also know, Theo, of some interesting research which says that if forgiveness is mentioned within a restorative justice setting, people don't feel safe. And it's more likely that people will put up barriers to the idea of forgiveness. But if it's not mentioned at all and people have a safe and well facilitated conversation, then it's far more likely forgiveness will happen. And it often happens afterwards with the tea or the biscuits or and unexpected. Certainly many of the stories I've collected that are restorative justice stories, because my focus has been on forgiveness, forgiveness has emerged. But I would say on almost every case, they've not gone into that room in the face-to-face meeting expecting to forgive. So it's been an outcome, but never a desire.
And it's so important to hear it from you, Marina. I like John Braithwaite's distinction of maximizing, minimizing standards, and then the gifts of restorative justice. And he says forgiveness is one of those gifts. And there's, by nature, a gift is not expected. A gift is given in a genuine way when you mean it and when it's the right time to give it. And if you don't feel giving it, I don't think restorative justice means that it's failed. It is that bonus that you might get, but as you said, it could become actually the opposite. It could cause fear. It could create a space of non-genuine dialogue. And where there is an expectation and that expectation is not met, I think that's where re-victimization might happen. Because if you go in there as a practitioner and say, yeah, you're going to get, what you expect, I think that's the wrong way to go about it. So yes, but that's why I just thought, let's just put it out there so that people don't think that, we're championing one version of restorative justice.
No, definitely. And I think it's problematic. It's a highly problematic concept, virtue, skill, whatever you call it, to be working with. But in a way, that's why I've kept with it, because it always creates interesting conversation. When we started working in prisons, because early on when I started the Forgiveness Project, all I knew was that we had this amazing exhibition that people were, flocking to, really. There was a kind of thirst, people looking for hope in very dark places. And people said, what are you going to do? You've started this charity. And it became clear to me we had to work with victims of crime and perpetrators of crime in some way. And therefore working in prisons and taking storytellers into prison to share their narratives would be a way forward. And we then developed a program which we call Restore. But before it was called Restore, it was called the Forgiveness Project's Prison Program. And we found that it wasn't a helpful word. People came with so many expectations around this word forgiveness. For a start, they thought it was religious. That
Hmm.
was the first thing, which we're not, we're secular. And the second thing, they thought we'd be there to persuade them to forgive, that this was in some way going to be good for their well-being and their mental health and their future.
Hmm.
And of course, it wasn't about that. It was a place of inquiry. What does forgiveness mean to you? When is it important? What is self-forgiveness? When is it not helpful? We look at the whole spectrum, and it's a really interesting landscape. And everyone's got a different opinion. Everyone's got different limits. So our prison program, which was in male prisons to start with, and we took in an ex-offender and a victim of crime to share their stories, and then we encouraged the men in the room to share their narratives. And we found that by modelling a way, sort of narrative techniques and restorative thinking, that we were able to actually make people think about responsibility, accountability, how they might change. But most of all, it was about connection. And it was a connection between the storytellers we brought in and the prisoners. It was about the prison officers and the prisoners. And it was about hearing other people's stories, because I realized very early on that people need to be heard before they will listen. See, a lot of these prison programs are about going in and telling people what they're doing wrong and how they can do it right. And it falls on deaf ears very often. We weren't going in with those sort of objectives. We were literally going in, modelling a restorative process. You could say like surrogates almost, the victim and the offender. Wasn't the same crime. They didn't necessarily know each other very well, but one came from a place of having harmed others. The other came from a place of having been harmed, and yet they were willing to work together. They were modelling a restorative process. The prisoners in the room see this, hear the story, share some of their own stories with very, very skilled facilitators. This is critical, and in restorative justice, I think. And change occurs. So,
Yes.
yeah.
And I kind of tried to find a philosophical kind of interpretation of what you said. And I wrote in one of my books about the concept of restorative justice pain, which then as a consequence transforms. And if it does transform and it does work, which is painful, is a different form of punishment, would then lead to forgiveness if it does. I wanted to bring another concept that I'm interested in quite a lot, and I did one of my books on this, and it's in the concept of power. And I want your view on whether you think forgiveness is an alternative form of power. And with every power, there's the good side and the bad side, isn't it? And it's how you exercise power. Do you see the connection, and do you think there are any risks around the kind of how we use that?
I do. I mean, what has been said to me many times by people is that they're taking the power back by offering forgiveness. So one example of that is a woman who was raped, who got to meet her rapist, which is unusual, as you'll know. But it happened after many, many years. And she said the fact that she was able to go into the room, have the difficult conversation, and then stand up and say, I'm leaving now, and going out of the room, and offering her forgiveness, which many people would find difficult and controversial, but for her own sanity, she did it. But she describes it in terms of taking the power back. And that I understand. I mean, that sort of makes sense to me, because you're taking the power back, because if you're full of pain and resentment and anger and rage and hurt, it monopolizes your life, and you ruminate. You go to bed at night thinking about something, you wake in the morning thinking of something. And there's something about forgiveness which releases that energy and empowers you. So I've heard that described in multiple, slightly different ways around power. But there is also the sense that forgiving can be a one-upmanship almost. So I particularly see this in intimate relationships or in friendship or work, where both people feel righteous anger, where both people feel right, where both people feel equally aggrieved. If we had this going on between us, Theo, and I was suddenly to tell you, well, Theo, I want you to know I've forgiven you, that becomes an accusation and even an act of aggression. And I've taken the power there. So I think Joe Berry, who I mentioned early on, whose father was killed by the IRA, and who then she went on to meet the man who planted the bomb after he'd been in prison for many years. She has an interesting take on forgiveness. She sort of basically sees it as a power dynamic that she doesn't want. So she doesn't want to use the word forgiveness. If you meet her and speak to her, you'd immediately think this is an extraordinarily forgiving person. She's met with this man who many called a monster. She's listened to him. She's understood him. She says, if I had lived Pat McGee's life, perhaps I would have made his choices, which is a sort of radical empathy, really. Nevertheless, she doesn't want to use the word forgiveness, exactly for the reasons that you've kind of hinted at, that it's her putting herself up and above him. And she actually says, now we're post-conflict, we're in a place of repair, of restoring. And so it's not helpful language anymore.
Yes, and what I found conceptually challenging with the notion of forgiveness, it's almost like it takes us back to the labels of offenders and victims. And I think what restorative justice offers is a move away from those labels and see the harm as opposed to the crime and the harming party or the harmed person. And the vicious circle of violence doesn't often distinguish who is harmed and who is harming. And exercising the concept of forgiveness, as you said, how you exercise that, it almost takes me back to, are we just back on the vicious circle of exercising power in a different way? Especially when it comes to young people or people who are caught up in violence or conflict that is not really their doing, whether it's their age or their mental health or their gender or their race. And that is why sometimes I feel a little bit cautious when I see this. Like you said, what is the concept that is central to restorative justice? If you're saying forgiveness, I become quite reserved when I hear that.
But also, Theo, you mentioned victim and perpetrator, and I've definitely used these terms. And we're trying to move away from using those terms. It's almost like a shorthand, because I know that everyone gets it immediately what I'm talking about. But it's not very helpful. We work in women's prisons. It's particularly not helpful there. And it immediately says there's someone who's right and someone's wrong. And sometimes we are both victim and perpetrator, harmed and harmer. So I think it's really important to be mindful of this, and we're trying to find a new language.
The way I'm dealing with it, at least, is just I'm focusing more on the harm, which is the focus, I think, of restorative justice. Just out of curiosity, and you've seen so many stories, you've had so many stories, you've seen different scenarios, whether it's at the international level, the interpersonal level, the intercommunity level. Have you noticed any patterns of forgiveness when it comes to what prompts people to offer forgiveness, not so much to ask for forgiveness, but offer forgiveness? Has it got to do anything with their age, with their gender, with their backgrounds, or do you just know it's just no patterns whatsoever?
There are patterns of what it looks like, but not necessarily prompt patterns in that from the many people I've spoken to. I suppose the most unusual, but it's definitely happened, is an instantaneous something happens. A harm happens to you, pain happens to you, and your immediate response is, I'm not going to add any more pain to this situation. I've got to go towards a place that looks like forgiveness. Very rare, but that definitely does happen. And it's like nothing will change that situation. That person is forever changed in that moment of harm. In, you might say, a positive way, but much more often, forgiveness comes as a result of a long process of trying other ways. And those other ways might be self-harm, hatred, revenge, silence, continually telling the story till you it's not helpful anymore. All these things are good in proportion, in moderation, for some time. I think it's when things get stuck. And one woman describes how she drove her friends away because after 5 years, she was still, that's all she was stuck with that. And she said, I had to find another way because what I was doing wasn't working for me. And then it opens up possibilities towards trying to understand the person who's hurt you, why they might have done it. Often, as I said earlier, it is the actual encounter. It is that face-to-face restorative justice meeting where you see that person as human, a human being, you know, maybe even quite brave coming into the room to explain what they've done, why they did it. And that shifts the dynamic. There was one woman who's from Canada whose father had been murdered by a man who was schizophrenic, who lived next door, and he'd had an episode. And she was just taken over by rage, understandably. She was a teenager at the time, for decades, until this man had enough help that they felt it was safe to release him. She didn't want him. She said, the longer he remained in the prison, the greater the value of my father's life. She campaigned for him not to be released, but it wasn't going to happen. Then she was offered the possibility of meeting him. And it's powerful and moving the way she described. She said, you know, in that 1 hour, 40-minute meeting, 17 or whatever it was, 17, 20 years of hatred just evaporated. And she reached out. She saw he was a broken man, that he was deeply regretful. She saw him as a human being. She hadn't expected to. She hadn't expected to forgive him. Changed the course of her life, and I'm sure his as well. And that's just not that uncommon, it seems, from these meetings. Well, having said that, it probably is uncommon. It's just that it does happen, and I have focused in on finding those particular restorative narratives.
Just on the issue of, you know, crime, if you want to call it crime or harm, at least as a lawyer, right, it belongs to the public law sphere because it's in the interest of the public. And that's why it's dealt by, you know, criminal courts and the state prosecutes on behalf of the victim, right? Do you think, with that in mind, that there is ever a point where forgiveness could be inappropriate? So you watch and say, oh, I forgive you and blah, 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 blah. But you're feeling that whatever harm that person did to the other is actually in the public interest and you don't have a right to forgive because it impacts on me as well.
Well, it is a very personal thing. So I think it's hard to sort of be judgmental. When it's interpersonal between the person who's harmed and the harmer, it's hard to sort of say that's inappropriate. But I think the minute it becomes something in the public, where I'm thinking of Charleston, where there was a white supremacist went into a church and killed a lot of black, well, under 10, maybe 8, 9 black parishioners. Very soon after, there were some of the relatives, even the next day, spoke about forgiveness. And it became a big sort of debate online. And people saw that as harmful. Because in some ways, it got a lot of media attention. You know, it does. Forgiveness seems to attract the media. Because people don't expect it. But harmful. Because in some ways, it got a lot of media attention. You know, it does. Forgiveness seems to attract the media. Because people don't expect it. But harmful. Because in some ways, it got a lot of media attention. I think the trouble was that people said, does white violence does black people's forgiveness condone white violence? That was the thing. And I think some activists within that community found it very unhelpful. because sometimes it's about systemic failure. Sometimes it's about, do you have to call out accountability? Is forgiveness really appropriate when nothing changes? And might it just ensure that the wrongdoing continues? So I think when it becomes part of sort of national debate like that, it can become quite problematic. But I'm hesitant to say it's harmful, because it might, for the individuals who are the ones who are the primary victims, it can be the thing that makes their life worth living again. It is transformative in that respect. So I've seen enough examples of that.
Yeah, and that is a very good example. I had a similar example of a case that I was involved in, which was in relation to child sexual abuse. This was with the scandals in the Catholic Church. And there was a case that was actually diverted to restorative justice. And as you probably remember, there was a lot of cases going to court and getting a lot of kind of compensation out of it, you know, massive cases, especially in the US. And there was this case where, you know, the child then, but now an adult, actually met with the priest. And after doing restorative justice, forgave the priest. And as you know, also forgiveness is attached to religion as well. And this was a devout Catholic. So he exercised that Catholic, let's say, right to forgive. And that also became public. But it backfired because he was criticized. How dare you forgive? Because it was almost like he was forgiving all of the perpetrators within the Catholic Church that exercised power and abused the children at the time. Also, the cases in court became a bit more complicated because they were going through compensation. So all of that became one big mess. And it was like, you know, that's why I was asking, where do you think, you know, we draw the line? Because forgiveness is a personal thing. It's a very, very, very personal thing. And, you know, the other thing that they could say, how dare you, not allow me to forgive? It's my decision to forgive, and it is my life to live. But this is two examples that were just presented, that actually when we forgive, there might be actually consequences for others.
Yeah, and I think that sort of diminishes the whole idea of forgiveness. And certainly there have been many cases within the church where people have been protecting their institution or their particular church or even a person, and the protection comes in the form of forgiveness or of suggesting forgiveness. It's a way of sort of wiping it away, a clean slate. But of course that doesn't happen, and it just rumbles and it comes up later. Because I think accountability is really important. And accountability and acknowledgement, I've often thought, as healing as forgiveness, actually. Acknowledgement, because to be denied, when people have a harm denied, it didn't happen, or silence, or no court case, or that can be so demoralizing, and it can keep people just as stuck as sort of unforgiveness can.
Yes, yeah, and I mean, I'll say it openly. The other thing that kind of concerned me a little bit about forgiveness is this tendency to own it, whether it's a church saying, "Oh, God forgives," or another church saying, "Oh no, my God forgives," and another faith says, "No, my God forgives," and that kind of creates divides, which I don't think that's what restorative justice is. Restorative justice is about building bridges. So labeling it as "I own forgiveness" worries me a bit.
I agree, and it's sort of barnacled by eons of piety, I think, which doesn't help it. And we're often mistaken for being a religious Christian or organisation, which interests me because forgiveness it's a universal concept. It's about being human, and yet there are assumptions made.
I always like to kind of end with positive kind of message, and I'll start with a kind of an oxymoron, with a negative to lead to a positive. And I'm sure you feel probably the same way. You know, you turn the TV on and you see a war in Ukraine going on, Gaza going on, you know, conflict, and then we'll have our young people watching what we have been doing, you know, for the last few years, and then passing on to the new generation a mess, basically. And one has to ask, where does forgiveness nowadays sits with all this mess that we have made? You know, somebody who's been working on this for so many years, and forgiveness, and you've seen, you know, you spoke about Iraq and Afghanistan and all those sort of other conflicts that have taken place. What sort of kind of message would you say, you know, especially to the new generation, around forgiveness?
Well, I've always thought that in the heat of battle, whether it's two siblings fighting over an inheritance or two nations fighting over a border, it's no time to talk about forgiveness. People are hell-bent on survival, on power, on winning, on destroying. And I don't think it's a helpful or appropriate or necessary or the right conversation to be having. I think forgiveness is part of rebuilding. It's about mending broken hearts and restoring broken communities, and it comes in the aftermath. And I think everything you described before, we're in the heat of the battle.
Yeah.
It's so the nearest I will get to forgiveness in all these examples that you talked to. There will be peace one day. I don't know when, in say Ukraine or the Middle East, and it will take both sides talking and restoring something of humanity and finding a shared humanity. So all I can do at the Forgiveness Project, or we can do at the Forgiveness Project right now, is to model that. And there are groups working. So for instance, there's a group called Combatants for Peace in Israel, Palestine. There's Parents Circle, bereaved parents from Israelis and Palestinians. It's the hardest climate they've ever worked in. I'm sure they've lost some members along the way who just cannot be on the same platform. And yet we share those stories. They are talking out into this very difficult space, and they're getting attacked for it as well, because a lot of people want the polarization to be complete. And the toxic othering is so extreme that they don't want to see both sides together. But I think from the Forgiveness Project's point of view and my work, they're the one thing that I hold on to that give me some hope, that they're still working in this field, that they're talking across the divide, that they believe that there will at some point be an end to the violence. It may not be in our lifetime though.
Yes, well, I can share my own personal story. As you probably know, I come from a divided country. Cyprus is still divided since '74. I wasn't born then, but I've experienced the conflict. And when people are on a survival mode, the last thing they think about is forgiveness. But obviously, you know, many years have passed. You mentioned the word divide, and I met a group of women from the Turkish Cypriot community and the Greek Cypriot community who created a charity called Hands Across the Divide. And they come together and they give their stories, and they pursue forgiveness from each other as mothers, as sisters, as you know, they lost their husband, their children, or whatever. And that put, you know, after so many years now is the time. So maybe, I mean, the country's not united yet, but the communities are trying to heal, and they're trying to find peace. And I think what you said, I think, is very, very positive as a message, that peace will be one day. And I think if we allow communities to try and heal from the bottom up, this can probably be one of the ways they can do it. Story sharing and storytelling is what is at the heart of restorative justice. Not necessarily forgiveness, but definitely storytelling and listening. So thank you ever so much, Marina. It's been, you know, extremely, extremely interesting, and a special treat for me as well. I don't get to speak about forgiveness that often. Yeah, I want to thank you. But yeah, I want to want to thank you for the amazing work that you've done. Yeah, and you continue to do. Yeah, no, good luck again with all
Thank
this stuff that
you.
you're doing, the forgiveness project.